Hello, good afternoon. My name is Brian Dickinson. I'm a history teacher down in West Sussex, and this lesson is aimed at Year 7 and primarily history looking at the Battle of Hastings. So we're going to look at the start of the Battle of Hastings, why there was a battle, who was it between, and kind of a little bit about where it was fought and how. Okay, so what I want to do is just share my screen with you so that I can just bring up a PowerPoint. Okay, so William Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So the Battle of Hastings is one of the most famous ever battles fought. So we'll look at why did it happen, who took part, and why it is so important. So let's have a look at some of the people involved. First of all, there's Edward the Confessor. Edward was King of England. Edward the Confessor. He had no children, therefore he had no heir to the throne to become king after him. And when he died in January 1066, there were 4 people who all thought that they should be the new king. So let's have a look at who they were. So this is Edward the Confessor. Very religious man, which is why I called him the Confessor. First of all, there's a man called Edgar the Atheling. He was Edward's nephew, and so therefore actually he's nearest relative. So kind of, you know, they would have looked to him as his successor, but he didn't do things like that, quite like that in those days. However, he was often ill and only 14, and so not a particularly good age to be a king, maybe. And so, and that's, we think it's a picture of what he looked like at the time. Harald Godwinson. So he was born in England, and the people liked him. He was a leader. He was Earl, like a noble, like a lord, but it's called an Earl in Wessex. A King's Council, which was called the Witan, chose him to be the king, but he didn't have any royal blood. He wasn't actually related to the king. He was just a leading noble at the time, living in Wessex. He had won lots of battles for the King Edward as well. So he was a leader of men. He was good in battle. People liked him, and he was English. And this is possibly a picture of him. These are only artist impressions. There wasn't much in the way of pictures of these people back then. Then there was William, Duke of Normandy. So he was from France, Normandy in France. He was a distant cousin of Edward, but he lived obviously in France and spoke French. He said that Edward had made a special promise on the bones of some saints that he could be king. So at one time, Edward had been rescued from shipwreck by William many years before, and Edward promised that when he died, he could follow in his footsteps and be the king. And he swore it, a bit like putting your hand on the Bible. He swore it on the bones while touching the bones of an old saint. Dead saint, I should say, and that's shown in the Bad Tapestry as well, actually. So according to William, Duke of Normandy, he thought kind of God was on his side a little bit there, really. He was a very good ruler in Normandy and thought he could do the same for England. So people liked him. He was quite a ruthless ruler about that as well. And that's what we think is an artist's impression of what he probably looked like. Then there was Harald Hardrada. Now, Harald Hardrada, he was king of Norway, and the people in England were scared of him because he was a fierce and quite a cruel fighter, like the Vikings were. He wanted to be king of England as well because he wanted more money, land, and power. And it's also distantly related to King Canute, who was a king previously, a few hundred years ago, in England. So he thought he had a claim to the throne there as well. So now, and that's what King Canute may look like. So there was a battle up in York at a place called Stamford Bridge. And that's not the Chelsea home ground. This is in York, or near York actually. Harald Godwinson became king straight after Edward died. So they chose him, they knew that Edward was dying, and they chose Godwinson. So this incense, Harald Hardrada then came to England from Norway. He invaded, started to take over some cities. He planned to march to London to become king. But of course, there was a fierce battle, and he was killed by Harald Godwinson. And this took place, as you can see on the map, in the north. So because Harald Hardrada was a Viking from Norway, he came over from the North Sea, from Norway, and landed in Yorkshire and went to Stamford Bridge, and it was a fierce battle. So Harald Godwinson, who was then king, had to march his army all the way up to York and fought a fierce battle, killed many Vikings, and some of his own men were killed as well and injured, but he defeated them. In fact, if you were to go to York today, there's a Viking Centre, or Jorvik Centre as it's called, and there are ancestors even today in York who are descended directly from Vikings. They don't go around with pointy hats on, by the way. So now, oh, that was a mistake. Harold didn't have time to celebrate. After he'd won the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he had heard that William was sailing over from Normandy to invade England to become king. So William actually came over quite early, actually, because of the weather. He didn't want to leave it too late, so he came over. This is at the end of September, or middle of September, and he landed at Pevensey, and he waited. And his army actually had about 2 or 3 weeks of actually waiting around, and they practiced and trained and things like that. But whereas Harold's army were in the north, so what he had to do, they were very tired after the battle, but had to march 50 miles a day to meet William's army. So it took him quite a few days, quite a few weeks to march all the way from Yorkshire down to Hastings. And of course, they had fought a battle, so they were tired, they were depleted in terms of men, some of them were injured, and yet they still had to march. There was no trains, there was no buses, or horses they didn't really have horses back then, so they couldn't do it. So, the Battle of Hastings itself. At 9 o'clock, this was on the 14th of October, by the way, the 14th of October, and lasted most of the day. King Harold and his English army sat at the top of what is known as Senlac Hill and threw axes down on William's soldiers. They had heavy chainmail armour and found it hard to climb up the hill, but they were at the top. So, as an advantage, Harold's men were at the top of the hill, and that had some sort of advantage, obviously. Oops, that's a mistake. And this is a kind of artist's impression of what it would have looked like. The top of the hill there would have been Harold, and the bottom there would have been William's men. So which army was stronger? King Harold's English army was larger. He had his friends and his own bodyguards. He also had some professional soldiers called housecarls. He also had untrained farmers who were armed with pitchforks and slingshots are called fired. That's how we pronounce that word. And there's kind of a picture of what a housecarl would look like. Chainmail, and they got a helmet on. They got spears, usually kind of long pikes, and they would have had shields as well. Okay, so that's kind of how they might have also looked like. Oh, so big upon that other one would have been the other people in there would have been the fired. They would have been the untrained ones. So they were just farmers basically, and they didn't have any sort of armor. They would have had smaller spears, and they would have had smaller shields as well, and not much in the way of sort of protection, to be perfectly honest. William had fewer men, but and was at the bottom of Senlac Hill. So you would have thought actually he was in a big disadvantage. However, all his men were highly trained soldiers. He had also archers who could fire arrows at an alarming rate and really far as well. He also had thousands of men on horseback, and this is a major advantage. So not only did he have archers, which means that you can kill people from a big distance, and they would fire the arrows into the air down onto the English, but also, and they could load their arrows at an alarming rate. They could really do it really quickly. Having men on horseback, now these weren't just the sort of horses that you'd see on racing. These were big horses. They were large horses. And they had lots of them. So If you imagine a horse charging at you, you know, at full pelt, then it must be very, very frightening. And here's some pictures there of the archers. These would have been Norman, and their men on horseback as well. These pictures are from the Battle Tapestry, which obviously was made many years later after the Battle of Hastings, and was actually made by the French as well. So for six hours, it looked like the English were going to win. The Normans kept attacking, but were forced back down the hill. Then Harold's army made a big mistake. They thought William's men were running away and followed them down the hill. This was that they weren't. It was a trick, and they turned around and attacked them. So because what the French did was to run away and made the English run after them, and then turn around and fight them. So it broke up their shield wall, and they weirdly they did this twice, and it won. You know, they killed loads of the English that way, and he did it twice. So it shows you how clever the French were. You know, the William's men were, and he had much better tactics. So even though he had fewer men, they were on horseback. He had archers. And he had clever tactics as well. So, and Harold is obviously killed. William brought in his archers, and some people say that Harold got an arrow in the eye, though we can't know whether this is actually certain. In the Battle Tapestry, it looks like he's got an arrow in the eye, but unfortunately, there's some stitching on there which looks like some damage, so it may not be the truth. And in fact, there was some recent historians seem to think it didn't happen. Although what did happen, we do know what did happen. That when Harold was killed, a lot of the Normans broke through to the English and reached Harold and actually kind of chopped him up. Really, they cut him up really badly and killed him, obviously. And William was annoyed about this. He didn't think that the king should be treated in this way, especially as he knew him. And he punished his own men for that as well. And because Harold died and William won, he became new king and became known as William the Conqueror. And he marched then on to London. And don't forget, this was October the 14th. And it took him quite some time. So he got to London, and on Christmas Day, he was crowned king. The Battle Tapestry, which you may have come across, is a famous embroidery. There was a story of Duke William and Norman's invasion of England. Okay, it was orders to be made by William's brother, Bishop Odo, to celebrate the victory, and it's kept in Bayeux. So we go to Bayeux, it's there. It's a very long tapestry. You can see the videos of it if you get to there. It's about 20 inches tall and 231 feet long. Okay, about the length of 3 swimming pools. It's quite long. I've never seen it, but apparently they tried to get it to England. I'm not sure if they agreed on that, but it tells a story, obviously from the French side of the view as well. So one of the things that obviously William had to do was to keep England safe, as many people were not happy to see him as king. Obviously, the French person, he killed our king, and they didn't want to keep him there. So they began to build castles all around the country. He had just proved, hadn't he, that he couldn't invade England, so he didn't want it to happen to him. So he put lots of castles around the country, and it was a reminder to the English, wasn't it, to the Saxons, that we are now in charge. So if you live in a town or a village and you see a big castle in the distance, it would have been on a hill. It's a constant reminder that they're in charge, that they're much more important than you. So why is it so important? Well, it was 1,000 years ago. It's not been. England has not been conquered since then. All the kings and queens of England since then have been descended from William the Conqueror, so they can all trace their line, their family tree, back to William the Conqueror. And it was him that kind of started up this idea, not idea, but it set in stone almost that the next king will be the son, usually the son, sometimes the daughter of the current king. And there's other things. So anyway, so that is the lesson. I hope you enjoyed that and got quite a lot out of it. I hope that if you've got the recording, you can go back over it and watch some other parts of it as well. And we'll have a look at another time on how William sort of kind of controlled England afterwards as well. So he was quite a ruthless leader. Hope you enjoy that, and I hope to see you again soon.